welcome back to Dr. Olga Kirschbaum-Shirazki. Olga is a historian specializing in modern European history. She grew up in Toronto, holds an MA in medieval studies from the University of Toronto, and earned her PhD in modern European history from New York University. She's the co-founder and editor of Tel Aviv Review of Books, where she brings together a wide spectrum of voices on Israeli culture, religion, and politics. She also serves as a visiting fellow at the Tel Aviv Institute. As a researcher, educator, and translator, Olga works at the intersection of Jewish history, interreligious relations, nationalism, and the challenges of tradition and modernity. Her writing is known for cutting through ideological noise and offering clear, historically grounded perspectives on Zionism, the Middle East, and contemporary political debates. Welcome back, Olga. How are you?
Good, thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm enjoying very much your podcast.
Thank you so much. It's great to have you back also. We got really good feedback and reviews from the last time you were on, so I'm really looking forward to this. Also, we have with us my co-host and regular contributor, Dr. Leif Knudsen, as well. And today we're going to talk about a really interesting topic, how academics view anti-Semitism, comparing the major academic philosophical schools of thought and traditional Jewish thinkers and Torah-based schools of thought, both on how they view anti-Semitism, how we can combat it, and also if we can possibly learn something from the anti-Semites themselves.
Well, so I want to start by saying that I think people in Norway understand this, but many people around the world understand this too, that anti-Semitism seems to be, meaning the hatred of Jews or accusing Jews of all kinds of bad things, seems to be very popular. People seem to really like it and sort of coalesce around it, and it seems to appeal to people who are otherwise very smart. So it's not something that we can say that it's appeals to people because of they're ignorant or they're uneducated or they're they don't have they don't represent the highest sort of cognitive skills or anything like that. So the question has arisen by philosophers and people in the academy about what exactly this is, right? And why is it so popular, right? What is its appeal, right? And what can we do about it? And this was particularly true. So I want to, this is the field of anti-Semitism studies is a large field. It's not my field of expertise per se. There's some people who that's all that they do in terms of research. But as a historian of modern Europe, I had to engage with, to a certain extent, this field of anti-Semitism studies because the Europeans that I was studying were very attracted to anti-Semitism, at least a significant portion of them, but differently at different periods of time. And of course, prior to that, Europeans earlier than the modern period were also attracted to anti-Judaism. And again, it changes over time. So today, what I'm going to do is just sort of summarize for your audience the answers that three sort of important philosophers, thinkers of the modern period. So after the last major wave of anti-Semitism, I'm talking about World War II, right, where there's a state whose specific goal is the destruction of the Jewish people. So it is a state policy. And there are multiple countries and parties that collaborate with that state in Europe, including in Norway, right? And where there is popular support for this ideology of excluding at the least and at the most killing Jews. So why is this idea, and it includes and for reasons that the anti-Semites say have to do with the bad things that the Jews do, right? So there are three important thinkers who lived through this period, who thought about it and who tried to understand what anti-Semitism is. One of them is Hannah Arendt. Another one is, there are actually two of them together, Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer of the Frankfurt School. And another one is Jean-Paul Sartre. And all three of them dedicated specific works after World War II, and some of them were started during the war, on this question of how can it be that the Jews, who after all, let's remember, they're a small minority within the population of Europe. So why would anti-Semitism have such an important political impact to the extent that it did. So this was a reasonable question to ask, right? And so they're engaging in this question, and so they have some similarities in their answers, and they have some differences. Okay, so the first one we'll start with is Hannah Arendt, and she wrote a book called The Origins of Totalitarianism, and she has a whole section on anti-Semitism. And in this section, she makes the argument like this. And so part of it, I just want to kind of give a meta framework a little bit, is that some of this is describing what anti-Semitism is, right? And some of it is then answering the question of why it's popular, or what function it has, right? Which are two somewhat different things, right? So she thinks that the reason that the Jews become at the center of all of these political changes, ending up in this kind of genocidal anti-Semitism in the 1930s and 40s, is because of the Jews' own specific situation in European society, that they had this unusual relationship to the state and the nation, and that when the imperial movements of the 19th century, and she calls it the bourgeois and the mob, who are in favor of imperialism against this sort of nationalism, want to take over, then they attack the Jews as a means of attacking the state. And then what happens is that the frustrations of people are sort of projected onto the Jews. So that's her argument. So it's the Jews, that it's what scholars call sort of partly correspondence school and partly projection school. So anti-Semitism corresponds to some part of Jewish behavior. That's part of the root of why people are frustrated with the Jews. It has to do with something about their position in society. And then projection is, at some point, it moves from what Jews are actually doing to some kind of fantasy of the Jew, to which negative social feelings are projected onto the Jews. But she definitely has a strong element of correspondence. She really thinks that the Jews' own social position is a significant, and their relationship to the state is a significant factor. And in addition, the Jews' own desire to be separate creates a kind of antagonism with the nations where they live, which is then used by the bourgeoisie and the mob. So that's one argument. And we'll get into not all of these arguments are accepted. There are critics of these different arguments. The Frankfurt School argument is that really they develop this in the dialectic of the Enlightenment, and then in the authoritarian personality. And remember, in each case I'm summarizing right now, all of these have much broader developments. But they say, in dialectic of the Enlightenment, they say that modernity and capitalism, hasn't delivered on its promises. A lot of people are very frustrated. And so anti-Semitism is a way in which the people who owns the means of production divert people's anger to what they call the sphere of circulation. And Jews historically are related to the sphere of circulation, which is loaning money, right? So production is who owns, like in a typical Marxist view, who owns the means of production, like the industrial equipment, etc. And the sphere of circulation is money lending, selling goods, and the rest of it. So the people who are really benefiting from this capitalist order are diverting the frustrations of the workers onto the sphere of circulation. So that's one element of their theory, and the other element is that they develop even more, is that in the authoritarian personality, but also in part in dialectic of enlightenment, is this idea of projection, that it's not that there is a basis of correspondence. The Jews had historically had some role in money lending and selling and the rest of it, but anti-Semitism becomes a projection of the frustrations of these frustrated people by modernity onto the Jews. And so it's no longer, projection simply means that it's not an empirically or accurate view of the Jewish behaviors themselves. Rather, they start to see the Jews in terms of their own fantasies, their own views. So projection is a psychoanalytic concept, right? So I don't see you, Henrik, as who you are based on your behavior. Rather, the Henrik I describe is, all of my own projections onto Henrik because of my own internal feelings and frustrations. So they have developed this projection based and Hannah Arendt has some elements of projection based as well, because any sort of observer who lived through the Nazi period could tell that the relationship, if they were honest, the relationship between the propaganda of the Nazis and Jewish behavior did not match, right? Meaning that the way that Julius Streicher described the Jews it was in no way an accurate description if we were a sociologist or an ethnographer of Jewish behavior. There was a disconnect between what the anti-Semites said about the Jews and what the Jews did. Okay, so the Frankfurt School sort of has an answer to the why. The motives are these members the ruling class, who want to redirect the frustration of the working class and the people who are losing out of modernity, and they do it by redirecting it onto the Jews, who are part of an outgroup. They develop this even further in the authoritarian personality, where they say that the people who are susceptible to anti-Semitism are people who are very subservient and conformist to the in-group, but are frustrated with their own subservience and conformism, and so they take it out in aggression with the out-group. So they have this authoritarian personality, which instead of being free and making responsible judgments, they're subservient to this authoritarian structure, but then let out their frustrations in the people who don't fit in this authoritarian structure. So they say that the popularity, that it's a social phenomenon, and it's a very popular one because it corresponds to a psychological need. It gives some relief as to the frustration. And with the authoritarian personality, there's also an ego dimension, that that people can feel good about themselves in putting down the out group. So that's the Frankfurt School approach. Then Sartre's approach is somewhat similar to the Frankfurt School approach, in that for him, the anti-Semite has reneged on their freedom as an individual. He's an existentialist and has chosen in bad faith, right, to simply project his lack of freedom and all of his frustrations onto the Jew, instead of having a self-critical view of his position in the world. So it's kind of like a lack of responsibility. It's a little bit similar to the authoritarian personality, and that and so the anti-Semite projects also, has views the Jew in terms of all of their own failings, but instead of self-critically looking at themselves and engaging in a life of responsibility and good faith, which is his view. Okay, so all three of these theories try to some degree in relating to the question, is anti-Semitism a rational response to Jewish behavior, right? Because there are bad people. So if you say this person is bad, are you being prejudicial if they've actually empirically behaved badly, right? If someone murders someone and you call them a murderer, you're not being prejudicial, you're describing reality, right? They've murdered someone, so you've called them a murderer. Whereas if you call someone a murderer who hasn't murdered anybody, then the question arises, why would you be lying about that person? Why would you? So all three of these groups came to the understanding that there is some discrepancy between what the Nazi anti-Semites were saying about the Jews and how the Jews were behaving. And so they asked the question, well, what explains the popularity of this ideology where there's obviously a discrepancy, right? And what function does it serve? So those are the theories that answer these questions. There are two other scholars that are important. There's a scholar who's a historian, and he's more recent. He did not live through, he's born after World War II. His name is David Nuremberg, and he's a medieval scholar. And he asked the question, well, unlike the Sartre and the Frankfurt School and Hannah Arendt, who were philosophers who were very invested and interested in the modern period and were very much modernists themselves. They had abandoned religion. They were people who were influenced by the Enlightenment. David Nurnberg is a historian of the medieval period by training. And so he asks, well, anti-Semitism, this fixation on the Jews, it's not only that it's very popular in the modern period in World War II, but it seems to have been popular over a much more extended period of time, right, in Western civilization. And so what he again sort of asks the question about this, and he comes up with a theory about anti-Judaism, that anti-Judaism is a way in which Western thinkers, and he says really from the Greek and Roman period in through the Christian period up until the Enlightenment. So all through Western civilization in its pre-Christian, Christian, and post-Christian forms, that saying something is not Jewish or describing it as Jewish is is a kind of conceptual category that is used by Western people to delegitimize something. So it's like an insult. So if something is, if a thinker is accused of in the Christian period of Judaizing, they're doing what's antithetical to to Christianity rather. Or so he comes up with this theory, and he's sort of describing. He's saying that what we have here is a kind of social and intellectual structure that is a part of Western society, where Western society continuously kind of people within Western society affirm their legitimacy by disassociating themselves or accusing those who they think are illegitimate of being Judaizers or associated with Judaism. So these are the different academic theories. Now, the academic theories have all of them led to some questions, right? So people who are interested in the Frankfurt School theory, and the Frankfurt School theory does, seem to explain why through the Jews' historical role in the realm of circulation. There are still some questions that have been asked about that because, why not anger against Christian financiers in the same way? Why this degree of association? Since we know that historically there were Christian moneylenders also, and that there were afterwards Christian financiers, and also how do we understand pre-modern hostility towards the Jews? So those are questions that have been asked. And does this theory really explain the degree of investment of the Nazi state against, men, women, and children, who, after all, were a small minority, right? Like German hegemony over Europe could have been achieved without killing any Jews, right? It's not like they were an opposing empire that could have defeated the Germans, right? So there are kind of questions that remain of the Frankfurt School approach, though people are increasingly persuaded, and this is also true with Sartre's approach, that the Frankfurt School is correct in that what the anti-Semites say about the Jews seems to tell us more about the anti-Semites than it tells us about the Jews. So most scholars of anti-Semitism seem to agree with that point made very forcefully by the Frankfurt School. So and it's a point that comes up also in Sartre's thinking, and so and in fact, the Frankfurt School argued that Sartre was very close to them. People are in disagreement with Hannah Arendt again. This argument about the state, why would people? It's not clear why people would be. Hannah Arendt seems to say that the Jewish self-segregation plays a very strong role in why people would be hostile towards the Jews. And it still does not seem to explain the degree of this hostility, right? Again, we're talking about a state that has invested its energies and time and money in the killing of men, women, and children, right? It's hard to square that simply with anger against the state. So there are ways in which people think that Hannah Arendt has been too forgiving of anti-Semitic sources themselves. So though she also has an element of projection, she tends more towards the correspondence theory, that there's some closer correspondence between Jewish behavior and anti-Semitic. So people are angry at Jews for things that Jews actually do, right? So that's the correspondence theory. Now, many people who had adopted the correspondence theory, right? And the correspondence theory is based on Marx's critique of Judaism, between the relationship between Jewish usury and Judaism, etc. So the correspondence theory is mostly discredited, and most people adopt the projection theory. Now, most anti-Zionists today are correspondence people. They will say, I'm an anti-Zionist because of what Zionists do, right? So they will say, I hate Israel because what Israel does. They have a correspondence between their rhetoric. Most people who think that anti-Zionism is a form of Jew hatred that is irrational, meaning it will say that actually there isn't a correspondence between what Jews do and what the anti-Zionists say about them. And they will make these claims. So they will say it's not a correspondence, it's a projection. And they will base their arguments. They will say, look, the accusations of genocide don't fit our normal, universally applicable definitions of genocide, and therefore there is not a correspondence between the accusation of genocide and the actual act of genocide. They will say our definition of settler colonialism does not fit what the Jews are doing in the land of Israel, and therefore there is no correspondence between these two things. We are dealing with a projection. So this is a major difference. And they will say not only that, but people today who view anti-Zionism, through the Frankfurt School lens, will say, look, we also have, as we had during the Nazi period, we see that it's extremely popular. Look at all these young people who couldn't be bothered to go on the streets to protest against climate change or to protest against, women being murdered and beaten all over the world. And the rest of it seem to be very excited and interested in protesting against Israel, right? So anti-Semitism, and in this case, the anti-Zionist form of Jew hatred, if we use anti-Semitism as a generic for any form of Jew hatred, whether it's against the religion, whether it's against the people, whether it's against the state, right? So Israel-related anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism, right, which are the same thing, that's very popular. Just like racial anti-Semitism was very popular in the 1930s and the 1940s. Okay, or anti-Judaism had periods of extreme popularity in the Crusading period or the rest of it, and then other times, right? If it had been totally popular and genocidal all the time, the Jews would not exist anymore. So clearly, it's something that ebbs and flows. So the main questions that still sort of remain, and in a way, David Nuremberg, I think, answers this more than the modern thinkers, is that there's some kind of competitive dimension between Western thought and Jewish thought, right? And the Frankfurt School addresses this a little bit in that they say that the Jews as a diaspora people and they represent some kind of challenge to the established order, and because they've not fully assimilated, and therefore that is there's a kind of a challenge over hegemony and power, which is one of the reasons that that gets people so sort of excited. So I think though that's for the academic theories, okay, and we can I think that the academic theories today, and this the specialists of anti-Semitism will say that the academic theories today haven't answered the million-dollar question of how we can combat anti-Semitism. In the sense that if we really, like, for example, and if we follow the Frankfurt School, then basically we should be investing our money into teaching people not to have an authoritarian personality so that they would not be susceptible to this authoritarian structure, which has a tendency to focus on the Jews. So they would, or in the same, so they do sort of have a solution, but it's still, it hasn't been implemented and it doesn't seem to be so simple. And we also don't seem to have, shall we say, a deprogramming device. So we find a person who has an authoritarian personality. If we follow, how can we get them out of that authoritarian mode so that they're no longer jazzed up about Palestine and they're not spending all their time on campus lawns in relation to Palestine when there are so many other problems in the world, right? And when most of their interest is based on lies about the state of Israel. It's not based on objective actions of the state of Israel. So they would so the Frankfurt School people have somewhat of a response. You help people not have this authoritarian personality. You try and deal with the problems of capitalist society so that people aren't so frustrated and therefore aren't diverting their frustrations and anger towards the Jew. As someone like Sartre would say, you embrace your freedom and your responsibility, right? Again, so how do you do that? You don't engage in bad faith, you engage in good faith. And I think that I think that intuitively, or at least experientially, many Jews or allies, people who oppose anti-Semitism on principle, will say that they notice these characteristics of people who are opposed to both anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. That these are people who are not engaging in projections. They are people engaging in reality. They're people taking responsibility. They are people who have a commitment to truth, and they are so. There is, I think, very great merit in these philosophical approaches, particularly of the Frankfurt School and of Sartre. They don't, however, deal so much with the transhistorical, and that's where David Nirenberg comes in, right? And I think he does. He makes an important point, but in my view, he goes too far. That Western society it defines itself in relation to Judaism, and I think he goes too far only insofar as that it's true. You can notice many important Christian and Western thinkers who use Judaizing or Judaism as a slur, as something negative, to which they separate themselves. But we have other instances in the West of Jewish thinkers who are inspired by the biblical books, or who are not necessarily, operating in this field of defining themselves, positively in relation to a negative Jew. Right. So recently there's been a lot of scholarship about the Hebrew Republic. This was a period in 17th century British thought where many British thinkers were positively oriented towards the Bible and towards specifically the book of Deuteronomy as a kind of constitution. Right. So it's hard for us to understand this inspiration, even if they didn't think that living contemporary Jews embodied this. If right, if anti-Judaism was so fundamental to Christian structure, then one would have assumed a rejection of the Old Testament. And in fact, there were early Christian thinkers who wanted to reject the Old Testament. And there was a big, during the third and fourth and fifth centuries, there were debates between the thinkers who wanted to reject it and those who wanted to accept it. So I think that David Nirenberg is on to something, but I don't think it doesn't, at least this is my evaluation, that it doesn't tell the whole story of the West's relationship to Jewish texts and to Jewish civilization in terms of its texts and the rest of it. What are the Torah like? So if we think of philosophers, I'm very much a student of the Paris School of Jewish Thought, and the Paris School of Jewish Thought said that just like the West and philosophers are thinking about the world and have their texts, we don't need to. We can engage in the Torah as a source of thought, like a source of philosophy about the world. We don't need to be embarrassed. We don't need to put it in the category of religion and separate it from philosophy. We can engage in all of these things together. And I think a lot of modern anthropologists have come to the same, right? They've what they call decentering, right? There isn't sort of, there is rationality, right? What we observe about the lived world. And then there are worldviews. There's Western ones, there's Jewish ones, there's Muslim ones, there's all kinds of other cultures. And so what the within the Torah sources, so we talk about the Bible, or we talk about the Talmud, or we talk about the Kabbalah. So there are descriptions of all kinds of instances where the nations are against the Jews, right? They have some kind of war with the Jews. They enslave the Jews. They conquer Jewish territory. They stop Jewish practices. So the Jews' own books, right, its own civilizational books, are a testament to an antagonistic relationship between the Jews and the nations at times, right? And there are also instances in the Torah sources of a friendly relationship between the nations and the Jews, meaning not all of the instances of encounters between the nations and the Jews are antagonistic. Some of them are friendly. For example, King Solomon, he has an alliance with the king of Hiram, and he builds the temple together with him, with his building materials, the famous cedars of Lebanon and the rest of it. There are various alliances. There are various characters in the biblical stories that are heroes or heroines who are not Jews, but who work together with the Jewish people, whether it's the daughter of Pharaoh, whether it's Rahab the prostitute who helps the Jewish spies, whether it's so it's not always antagonistic. So what is the difference between in the Torah sources between these antagonists of the Jews and those who are not antagonistic towards the Jews, or to use our modern term, between those who hate the Jews, right? So and those who are allied with, or who make deals with the Jews, or who right? What is the difference? So descriptively, the Torah sources describe kind of in some ways some kind of like power competition, right? Some kind of hegemony. So the Pharaoh of Egypt, he's worried that the Jews are somehow going to outnumber him, right? That's the whole basis within the text, that the Jews are somehow going to multiply. They're going to have some kind of control over Egypt. They're going to be a competitor to the Egyptian state, and therefore he has to kill the Egyptian children. So we have basic geopolitics and power relations are one of the considerations. Another of the considerations, in a way, is ideological. This is already expressed within the biblical text with Pharaoh's very sort of stark statement: "Who is this God? I don't know him." Right. So a kind of contest of authority. Right. So Moses and the Jews have this one God whose authority they are relating to, and they're asking to worship this God. And Pharaoh says, you are answerable to my authority, and I am not answerable to the authority of your God, right? So this is what one would call a kind of hegemonic contest, right? And this we see in the modern period. We see hegemonic contests between different ideological groups. And then you have you sort of in the biblical sources, you have these two groups that are sort of given a characteristic that they despise the Jews. That's the sort of group. It's given like in the biblical stories. They're actually a tribal group, the Amalekites, who just despise the Jews and therefore want to kill them. So these are the descriptors of the antagonists or haters of the Jews. So we can see this in all the different stories of Bilam, the prophet who's sent to curse the Jews, or Balak who wants to defeat them, or the Midianites who wants. So our biblical stories have a lot of this antagonism, as well as what I said, cooperation. And so how do the rabbis and the Talmud, right, is an interpretation of these texts. And then the Kabbalah is also, one can understand the Kabbalistic text is also an interpretation of biblical texts, right, to give us greater information to understand what these different things are. So here, there are a couple of thinkers who have given us greater interpretations. So the rabbis explain to us that really the issue is a question that the Jews are exemplary, meaning that the antagonism, as well as the cooperation with the Jews is in fact an antagonism or cooperation towards God. So the Jews are in their relationship to God, in their receiving of the Torah, and in their covenant have this relationship to God. And so people who are positively inclined towards God tend to be positively inclined towards the Jews, and therefore and will work together or even convert to Judaism. So the famous position of Ruth the convert is, your God is my God, your people is my people. So she is positively inclined towards the God of the Jews and positively inclined towards the Jews. Whereas those who are antagonistic, like Pharaoh, who says, "Who is this God? I don't recognize him," right? Don't recognize the authority of God, do not want to recognize the authority of God, will be antagonistic towards the Jewish people. So in fact, it is really it is a spiritual element and their own antagonism. So what do the rabbis describe as the antagonism? Why would they be antagonistic towards God? There are many people among the nations who are not antagonistic to God, but why would people? Because they do not want to follow the moral laws that God has imposed on humanity. So that would be the reason. So that is an idea that, for example, is developed by a contemporary rabbi called Rabbi Raphael Shor. He also directed a movie about anti-Semitism, and he has a book called Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Jew? And he says if you look at the writings of the anti-Semites, the writings of Hitler and Mein Kampf or the rest of it, you will see that Hitler openly opposes Jewish morality. So that Hitler is very clearly and explicitly saying that he opposes Jewish morality. So and the Jewish understanding of God and the Jewish all of these things. And so what he is saying is that the anti-Semites' own discourse, even today, seems to affirm the traditional Jewish perspective that there is a clash of worldviews. There's a competition between sort of a competition of power and of worldviews, and that the anti-Semite is not satisfied in simply saying, I don't agree with the Jews, and therefore I am going to live my life differently. But rather, they seem to want to also destroy the Jews, the very possibility of that. So this would be a one of the kind of a modern development of a traditional perspective. Another development of the modern development of this traditional perspective is in a book by Sarah Judith Schneider called "You Are What You Hate." Is that it seems so that there seems to be some kind of relationship that the anti-Semites don't seem to just by chance choose the Jews, that there's a deeper spiritual relationship between the anti-Semite and the Jew. And it seems that the anti-Semite seems to have real ambitions, right? As it seems they understand the power of the Torah and of the Jew. And I'm going to get back to Sarah Judith Schneider in a minute because we actually have to develop another point first, which is that that's one element in the Torah's discussion of anti-Semites, this element of hegemony and of authority, right? That the anti-Semite does not recognize the authority of God and therefore is against the Jew, and the Jew as the representative of that authority is then they want to fight them. But how do we explain then that anti-Semites sometimes from an internal Jewish perspective, right, within these texts, how is it that anti-Semitism or hatred of Jews occurs when Jews are misbehaving, when they are not following the precepts of God, right? Why would there be if Jews are assimilating or they're following the hegemonic power or the ideology of other cultures, why would anti-Semitism occur at that point in time, right? And this is, of course, the story of Purim, right? When the Jews are in Persia, and when they are not staging a rebellion against the Persian Empire, The story of Purim is not about an empire that decides to kill the Jews because the Jews are openly rebelling, saying, we don't want to follow your law. We want to have our own laws. We want to separate from you, and we want to regain our sovereignty. Quite the opposite. The Jews in the Purim story have integrated pretty well into Persian society at that point, to the extent that the rabbis talk about that they are sitting at and participating in. This is a rabbinic commentary on the Megillah of Esther. They are sitting in and participating in the celebration of King Ahasuerus. And what is his celebration? That the temple has not been rebuilt. Right. So what could be a greater expression of assimilation to this? And they're at a banquet, right? There's so the banquet is, of course, of the Persian. So it's an expression of subservience to Persian authority. So how, in that context, do we have a personality like Haman who comes up and who's ready to annihilate? And not only that, but what is Haman's accusation against the Jews? He accuses them of having an entirely different law, right? There are people who doesn't recognize the law of the Persians. So there seems to be a dissonance there. By the way, we see this dissonance a little bit in the Nazi form of anti-Semitism also, because the Nazi period is a period, at least where, as far as the German Jews are concerned, not so much the Jews of Eastern Europe, where there's a large degree of acculturation to German culture, right? A large degree. So the parts of Mein Kampf that talk about Jewish morality as being sort of polar opposite to Aryan morality and the rest of it, sort of don't totally fit, with the what's going on with the Jews. So the internal within the Jewish texts, right? And by the way, that's one of the reasons, for example, that the modern philosophers who are dealing with anti-Semitism don't deal that much with Judaism. Sartre, not at all. He thinks it's completely irrelevant. The Frankfurt School, to some degree, a little bit, right? That the Jews are not fully assimilated. There's something different about them. They talk a little bit about Jewish negative theology, which means that what you can't say about God, and that, or a Jewish prohibition against idolatry, and that this still has some kind of philosophical resonance, and that's one of the reasons why Jews are targeted. So they talk about it a little bit, and Hannah Arendt, not really, only insofar as she thinks that Orthodox Judaism creates antagonism in the diaspora host populations because it separates the Jews. So they don't really deal with it in the internal sources. Because they're based on a kind of theological worldview, they say when the Jews don't do what they're supposed to do, then they get enemies, and there it's interesting. The Torah the commentators, rabbinic commentators, sort of combine a little bit. They say that if the Jews assimilate too much, then there's antagonism towards them for maybe wanting to take over that culture, right? So in the case of in the biblical story of Egypt, the Jews are quite assimilated, and then suddenly the Pharaoh has this paranoid fantasy that the Jews are going to take over Egypt, and that's why he has to kill the firstborn sons. So the rabbis say that they raise antagonism because of that, because they're going to take over, they're going to be in power. And we see that in the Purim story a little bit, in that Haman sees himself as an adversary to Mordechai. He's worried that Mordechai, so that dimension is there. And also then there's a kind of meta-historical theological dimension in the rabbinic sources, that it's also the way that God, in fact, gets the Jews to return to their requires them forcibly to repent by having this external adversary. So that is, and then with that, the Jews are then forced to repent, and that, of course, this is the Megillah, right? Esther repents, Esther goes before the king, and then what happens subsequently? The Jews accept the Torah again, and then they rebuild the Second Temple. So these are the kind of the main rabbinic perspectives. I will add now the final one, and my own sort of thinking on this for our own particular moment, and then I guess and then we'll go to questions because I have been speaking for a long period of time. So Sarah Yudit has this interesting book based on the writings of a Hasidic thinker called the Kamarna Rebbe. And the Kamarna Rebbe had he had this question. He was one of the students of the Baal Shem Tov, and he had this question of, why these holy people like the Baal Shem Tov had these enemies who were accusing them of all kinds of nefarious actions, especially when the Talmud says there's an idea that if someone accuses you of something, there's always some element of truth. So this, for a student of the Baal Shem Tov, is a tremendous paradox. How can my holy master, who's accused of these unbelievable sins, how can there be an element of truth? So he develops an entire Kabbalistic theory over the idea that enemies are kind of soulmates. And so this is part of a general Kabbalistic view that we are an interconnected humanity, right? And we all have parts of each other. Every interaction that we have with another person, right, elevates our own consciousness and our own God consciousness. And so your enemies are specific to you. They're interconnected with you, right? And so that's why, and so it's not, and then he sort of develops this idea that there are sparks of people's souls. And so the holy rabbi, is not guilty of these accusations, but rather his enemies themselves. And so there's projection. So the Hasidic thinking develops this concept of projection, and that there's a higher degree of, through this encounter of having an enemy, people are challenged in their moral fortitude, and these challenges bring a higher degree of consciousness. And it's developed even in a further way, where if one has an enemy who comes to kill you, one ought to have some kind of military exchange with them, but one ought to also pray for one's enemies to repent. So there's a theological dimension and a universalistic one, which is that it's not that unlike the Christian teaching, that you turn the other cheek to the enemy, but it's rather that you would wish that the enemy would come to their own senses, right? Getting back to this antagonistic relationship, the general Jewish perspective that the whole world should have this positive relationship to God. And so one should wish that the enemy of the Jews, and ergo the enemy of God, would repent and do the right thing. And therefore, the appropriate response. So if we get now to the practical dimension, so if the philosophers of the Frankfurt School say you need to raise children who don't have an authoritarian personality, who are responsible, and you need to create a society that doesn't have capitalist exploitation, and Sartre would say you need to enlighten people to have good faith and embrace self-criticism. The internal Jewish perspective is you need to inspire people through prayer, a good example, to repent. And if anti-Semites are murderous, and you as a Jew need to repent yourself, because your enemy is not by chance, they're involved in this interconnected perspective. My own final thought about this is I was inspired by the writings of Raphael Shore, who said, let's look at what the anti-Semite is saying and interested in. Right? So much of the schools of thought are looking at projection, and they're saying, well, the anti-Semite is saying much more about themselves, right? So the Turkish government that is harping on Israel's expansionist aims and the rest of it is, of course, itself guilty of expansionist aims, right? Erdogan is absolutely a neo-imperialist. So all of what he's projecting onto Israel, right? And even if it's true that there are some members of the cabinet who want to annex the West Bank or want to annex Gaza, nobody has an imperial program that includes the entirety of the ex-Ottoman Empire in the current Jewish government. So there's no imperial Jewish program, but Erdogan certainly has an imperial program. So he is absolutely projecting onto Jewish leadership his own things. Still, my question was, okay, it's interesting, though, when we look at, let's take Western anti-Semites, or anti-Zionists, of which there are many in Norway, okay? Many people who are very jazzed up about anti-Zionism in Norway, very excited by it, very involved in it, very interested in it. Okay, so what are they saying? What are their values, right? So they view themselves as universalist. They view themselves as fair. They view themselves as committed to law and dialogue, right? Though that is their self-perception, right? And then they project onto the Jews the opposite of all of those things. Okay. Now, are the Norwegians themselves really fair? Are they really involved in dialogue? Are they really as universalist as they say? No, most of Europe benefits from the exploitation of the third world, right? They have outsourced their dirty economy, and etc. So they are, many of the things they accuse the Jews of still, and this is my contribution, philosophical, if you will, but I would also say Torah contribution, is they are still interested in a topic which, at least in theory, the Jews should also be interested in, right? The Jews should be interested in universal justice, right? It's part of the Torah. We should be interested in fairness. We should be interested in dialogue. So I would add that I don't know if it will end anti-Semitism, but I would say that whenever we look at the anti-Semites who always invoke a moral reason, whatever it is, right? They have some kind of moral reasoning in their accusations, right? And even if it's like Haman and the Purim story, to invoke the authority of the Persian emperor, and that being the proper moral or political order, okay? It's an opportunity for, when there's a moral element being invoked, or it's an opportunity for the Jewish people to look at that topic and to say, how can I, as a Jewish person, express in the public sphere what Judaism has to say about these moral topics, right? So, and whether in response, so it's not simply to defend the state of Israel against these false accusations, which is certainly important. We need to maintain a rational public sphere where truth matters, but also to say all of these things that you Norwegians are interested in, fairness, dialogue, universal law, actually Jewish civilization and culture has a lot to say about these things. And this is what it has to say. And here, let me enumerate and discuss those matters. So with that, I will conclude my lecture part, and then we can go into questions.
Thank you for this introduction, Olga. For this erudite analysis and overview. It was really, really interesting, and I have so many questions. And but first, I guess, what would you say are like the commonalities between the philosophical approach and the Torah-based school of thought? Like, where do they possibly converge or agree on this topic?
So there's definitely a commonality on the point of projection. And this is because the Torah is not dissociated from reality, right? In order for you to follow Jewish law, you have to be compos mentis. In fact, one of the things that disqualifies a rabbi from issuing a rabbinic decree is if they're non-compos mentis. Because even if they remember the halacha by heart, if they are deluded and don't see reality, then they cannot make a proper judgment, right? So the Torah approach also views anti-Semites as being paranoid, right? As being and as lying in relation to Jewish behavior or the Torah, even in instances where Jews are misbehaving. Meaning, the issue is not that Jews always behave wonderfully. There are plenty of criminal Jews. It's not. That's not the point. The point is the disconnect between individual criminal Jews, or even even let's say there are specific Jewish communities that engage in more criminal behavior than others or whatever, there still is a marked disconnect between the discourse of anti-Semites and anti-Zionists and the Jewish behavior. It's a degree of exaggeration or in many cases invention, right? That is not rational, right? And you can't give it. Why would a person rationally exaggerate, invent, project, right? So it's not. So that is the commonality between the Torah perspective. And because the anti-Semite can't simply say, "Well, the Jews are completely right, but I want to destroy them for my own ego purposes," and the rest of it. No, that's not that. I'm debased and a horrible human being, and that's why I'm going to destroy the Jews. No, there's also the other element is the ego dimension. And that's another commonality. So the person with the authoritarian personality doesn't admit to having an authoritarian personality and to having a weak ego and an unresolved relationship, being servile to authority on the one hand of their in-group and that. So they don't admit to this, right? Part of admitting to this would be coming out of the authoritarian personality and moving towards a greater freedom and ego. So that there's an element, that element of ego is there, right? That they're somehow they unwilling to have subordinating themselves to a larger truth, or unwilling to have a kind of relationship with other people in reality that might include them saying that they're wrong or not being in a hegemonic position or not. So there's something unrectified about the ego that's common between the Torah sources and the philosophical sources, something immature, something not. That's the other element, in immaturity in the behavior that we see in particular, less so in Hannah Arendt. And in fact, she's the least respected in terms of contemporary sort of theory of anti-Semitism. The Frankfurt School and Sartre are more respected, and the Torah sources is kind of maturity and ego dimension.
Do both schools of thought say something about the people who are resilient and resistant to anti Semitism, who has kind of like this immune system against it so that they aren't overcome and taken over by the anti Semitism?
Right. So in the Torah perspective, right? So the people who are not anti-Semites are people who accept a kind of higher moral order, and who see the Jews as being part of that higher moral order, and who work with them. And presumably not, if they encounter an individual criminal Jew, they're not going to just like them because they're a Jew, right? Meaning in the kind of archetypal sense, right? Not, whereas, and the same thing. So the Sartre would say the self-reflective person who has good faith is not, um, you know, not interested in this bad faith, obsession with the Jews to make them feel better. And the same thing of that. It's a kind of a moral, a sort of moral slash psychological, and in the case of Sartre, existential posture that people have. So Sartre would see himself as an existentialist as being immune to the bad faith of anti-Semitism, and in fact, that's why he can even sort of write it, right? And and in the case of the Frankfurt School, they think that this is developed in childhood and forms of education, right? The Torah perspective it doesn't have like a total answer to this, in the sense that childhood education towards morals, it doesn't mean that some people don't still have this hegemonic desire, or don't so there in the from the Torah perspective, there seems to be some element of people coming with greater or lesser degree of in their nature ego desire, and the extent to which they can overcome that. But the Torah perspective is clear that anybody, there's even a whole discussion whether Amalek can do tshuva, right? Whether all, because it's a sort of foundation of the Torah's philosophy of humanity, if you will, that people have free choice. So they can choose to move from from an ego-based hatred of the Jews and God to something different.
And I'm going just the last question, Life, and you can take the floor. You mentioned archetypes, Olga, and I was going to ask you about that because I've been reading a little bit of Carl Gustav Jung, the man who coined that term. I think I've been reading like the archetypes of the collective unconscious and such, and archetypes such as like the old wise man, the trickster, the king and the queen, the thief, the hero. Would you say is there something archetypal about the Jew? Perhaps that's why it's so deep in our culture, and perhaps there's something in the collective unconscious about the Jew as an archetype.
So I haven't personally encountered Jungian theories of anti-Semitism. In I as I was sort of reviewing what I already know and preparing for this lecture, it's something that I thought about, and I haven't. They don't come out as that. There's a sort of clear Jungian um, characteristic for the Jew as an archetype, and maybe I haven't. Maybe this is um, a lacuna on my part, so your viewers can look this up a little bit more, or you can bring it up in another talk. But certainly, um, there is a way in which the Jungian thought of integrating your shadow and having a more mature personality sort of aligns with the kind of not having an authoritarian personality, or having a sort of mature morality where you are a human being that is taking full responsibility. So you're not simply disassociating from your shadow and then accusing other people or projecting or being defensive. Rather, when you've integrated your shadow, you are um, being a responsible person. But I don't know of Jung's, if he himself developed a specific archetype for the Jews in the West. Um, we can actually, can you look this up while Life
Yeah,
asks me a
definitely,
question?
definitely. Take
Yeah.
the floor, Life.
Yeah, so I have three questions. The first one should be fairly straightforward, but then there's the second one, which is pretty big, and the third one, which is really big. So you'll have to punt whatever you want to punt here. But the first one is when you talk about the Torah perspective, a lot of the audience in Norway will assume that what you're talking about is the written Torah, the Pentateuch. But I think you understand a little bit more than that. Can you just define that for us so that the
Yes.
listeners and viewers can understand what you mean?
Yeah. So again, I'm influenced by the Paris School of Jewish Thought, and so for Europeans, the best word I think is civilization. So the Jewish word Torah itself is related to the word teaching. The word Jewish law in Hebrew is related to the word the walking, right, about how you act, etc. So there's an epistemology that's interior to Jewish civilization. But if we use a kind of corresponding a term for European culture, the term is civilization. So that includes foundational texts like the Hebrew Bible, the 5 books of Moses, and it includes additional texts that are interpreting those 5 books of Moses, or are viewed within Jewish civilization as being additional revelations, right? So whether, and here I'm relating to this, I'm not talking about their authority, whether they're divine or whether they're man-made. I'm talking about their content, right? So what they say about the world and how they interpret the world, in the way that, the ancient Greeks, many of them believed that their philosophies were divinely inspired. Right now, when we study philosophy, when Norwegians go and study Greek philosophy, they don't spend a lot of time thinking about whether Plato and Aristotle and the Sophists and the Socratics and were divinely inspired, even though many of them write about their inspiration from the Muses. They talk about the content of their philosophy. And what the ideas that's expressing. So that's how I'm relating to Jewish thought right now. For lack of a better term, I'm relating to it as a body, a civilization, with the philosophy about how the world operates, about people, but that also includes rationality, right? One of the reasons Norwegians today can read ancient Greek thought is because the Greeks are not writing about Martians. They're writing about things that Norwegians today can recognize: human beings, the natural world, rocks, right? So philosophers about, and the logic, so philosophers even from a different culture and time and space are still, we can interact because of this common empirical reality and human logic.
Wonderful. Thank you. Okay. The second one is, and at the risk of being sort of reductionist, but as I was listening to everything you were explaining, and it was very enriching, the thing that occurred to me is, if I could reduce this, it seems to me that the notion of a Jew as a projection is has to do with the fact that civilizations, societies, cultures, whatever, always view themselves as protagonists of good forces, but they also always need an antagonist to explain why they're not succeeding, being as successful as they think they're entitled to be. And it seems to me that, the Jews, as, not as a real figure, but as an imagined figure, has always been a convenient explanation. And that seems to me to apply whether it's anti-Judaism in the Middle Ages, or even, the Roman Empire, and Hitler's madness, but also today, this idea of post-colonial, universalist mindset. The Zionism, or Jews who are Zionists, appear to be this antagonist that, that are very convenient. They're necessary for these myths to sort of perpetuate themselves.
So I want to say, I think that's a great question, and in fact, it's the question in some ways. And so I want to give an answer to this that compares the people who don't hate the Jews with the ones who do, and what's the difference. It's not that everybody needs an antagonist, right? Some people are happy to live in the world where they are themselves, other people are different, and they're interested in learning from each other and cooperating, and then in some kind of dispute resolution when there's difference. Okay, so meaning that antagonism isn't the only way to deal with difference, right? However, who are the people who are particularly prone to an antagonist? And this is where I think the philosophical point of the authoritarian personality comes in, or we see this in the in the Jewish perspective. Who are the main antagonists of the Jews? It's these empires that view themselves as the light of the world, right? And in fact, there is a correspondence between empire and idolatry, because what is idolatry? It's the man God. It's the man who is hegemonic, who has gotten to this. So it's the people, whether authoritarian or whether within the Jewish civilizational approach, don't accept their humanity or common humanity and see themselves as a man God. These people have a relationship to power, right? And where they want to be hegemonic, they want to be in a leadership, and they're not in a cooperative relationship with other human beings, right? And so why do these types of people, right? So it's not a coincidence that in addition to that Nazism has this imperial conquering idolatrous dimension of the the Untermensch, the subhuman, and then the Aryan, who's a semi-godlike figure, and the rest of it. So the antagonism comes when you don't have this cooperative, you don't have this idea that you can learn from other people. And this is again sort of related to the ego. If I have a strong ego and I'm comfortable in myself, I might be curious about other people. I won't necessarily be offended if they don't see things the way that I see them. I may have no need to submit them to my power. And in fact, from the Jewish perspective, you have, really there's only one power you should ever submit to. You should never submit to another person's power, right? That's idolatry. You should submit only to God's law. That's the Jewish philosophical perspective. So the notion of power and idolatry is very linked to that. So the people, for example, who are the people who've supported Israel after October 7th? Okay. And let's look at what is distinct between them and the anti-Semites, right? So first of all, there's the issue of reality, right? They are taking a cold look at the accusation of genocide, or the accusation of saying, does this is there really does it really make sense to call the Israelis Nazis? Is the final solution and the seven front war that Israel has been on something that is similar? So they have, first of all, they're rationally based, and second of all, they don't seem to be ideologically committed to a program of them being right. So one of the elements of, there isn't that arrogance. One of the elements of the anti-Semites is that they're mostly, whether it's the far left anti-Semites, or it's the Islamist anti-Semites, or it's the European liberal anti-Semites, is they're invested in a hegemonic program that they think the entire world should follow, right? And therefore, at some level, they see the Jews in Israel as a competitor. So this is the most obvious with the Islamists, for whom Jewish power, right, the state of Israel and its success is a direct challenge to Islam. How on earth could this small people have reestablished itself in land that was Islamist and the rest of it? So the Islamists, who are heavily invested in Islamic power all over the world, come up to the Jews in that way. The far left, right? The Jewish national self-determination, the persistence of Jewish culture and Jewish civilization, Jewish philosophical ideas, when they should be from a communist and a irrelevant, right? And yet they're not irrelevant, and they continue to return. There continues to be attachment and interest to them, right? Religion hasn't died, and so it's not simply that people structurally need an antagonist. It's not that I'm born a human being and I need an antagonist. It's how I relate to others in the world in relation to my own ego, right? In relation to power. And I think there is a fair amount of overlap between what some of the Frankfurt School and Sartre is circling around and the internal perspective within the Jewish texts.
Okay, are you ready for the third one?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is I'm struggling a little bit to articulate this, but because you alluded to it earlier, which is that it seems to me that if you think of anti-Semitism of a symptom of a malaise, of a serious illness within contemporary and ancient civilized and historical civilizations for that matter, but we can't do so much about them, but we could do about, what's going on right now. It seems to me that what we are saying is that the work that we do as Jews, from the Torah perspective, if you will, has sort of a redemptive quality to it, right? Because if we can counteract anti-Semitism, we are probably making the world a healthier place. This relates to your question of also about Amalek is, go ahead.
Yes, I want to relate to that both from the philosophical secular perspective and from the Torah perspective. So the philosophical secular perspective would say that by sort of combating anti-Semitism, first and foremost by just saying out loud that it's a projection and that's irrational, at least theoretically, may get certain people to say, what am I wasting my time on this projection? Meaning that they would redirect their energies away from a fruitless, right? What the Frankfurt School and Sartre have in common, and to a certain degree even Arendt, but in a little different way, is that anti-Semitism is an unbelievable waste of time. It's not only is it murderous to Jews, but it directs all of these energies which should be put elsewhere, right? It's a redirection of energies that should be constructive. So that is so any Jew or any person exposing anti-Semitism for what it is, as a kind of set of lies and projections, is allowing people to redirect their energies to something constructive, right? When you expose Norwegian anti-Semitism, you invite the Norwegian government to redirect their funds and their energy to constructive investments in the Middle East, to investments in Europe or elsewhere instead of, millions, hundreds of millions, or whatever dollars of investments in UNRWA, et cetera, without asking them to stop their anti-Semitism, which they, didn't do until like the late 2010s, et cetera. So that's the first part. And whether it's Jews or people who are not Jewish, anti-Semitism ought to be combated for those reasons. And societies that invest huge amounts of time in hatred of Jews don't have a good prognosis, right? Because that's
Right.
time not invested in other things. Okay. Now, what I'm discussing is that this is where the sort of the crisis element comes in. So the way, if there's anything to be learned from the anti-Semites, it's not in what they say about Israel, and certainly shouldn't be. And it's not that it's that they are usually there's something about what they're interested in that has that needs to be developed in a better, more corrected way. That would be sort of my Jewish interpretation. So this, if we go back to the Kabbalistic thought that the anti-Semite doesn't choose the Jew by accident, and it's not, what they're saying is not accidental. It's not simply so. It is a projection of what they're doing wrong, their accusations, but they're also interested in topics which relate to the crisis situation. And so it's an opportunity for Jews to offer alternatives, positive alternatives to this crisis situation. So when Mamdani, Mamdani or the left-wing anti-Semites today are talking about justice and talking about all these kinds of things. So let's offer a coherent program, right? And you can do that whether you're a secular person approaching it through human rights or natural law, which, by the way, I hope will be for another episode. It works with the Jewish universal teaching, which I very much works with natural law and secular morality. We can talk about that. Another point, or whether you're looking at, Torah ideas, for example, don't be subservient to people. If you're going to be subservient to a higher morality, right? So it's an invitation not only to expose the lies of anti-Semitism as lies that are dangerous to Jewish lives, but dangerous to the societies that, Norway has, in our last talk, Norway is an incredibly rich country with extremely talented people, right? Is history going to be kind to Norway? Will it say Norway has really used, and Norwegians are ambitious, right? They wanted in the Oslo Accords to participate in a major global conflict. They wanted to be a player in participating in that. So is history going to be kind to Norwegians? Say, oh yes, with their resources, with their human talent, etc. They really offered a lot to humanity to make humanity better. Or is history going to be unkind and say, well, why did they waste hundreds of millions of dollars on anti-Semitism? Right. So I think so that's, and for Jews, I think that Jewish civilization, the Western civilization, more and more in the Enlightenment was sort of, Europeans have reason and other countries are sort of filled with unreason, and we need to enlighten them. I think more recently there's been an understanding within Europe itself that every human civilization has something to offer and that we can learn from each other. And certainly within the Jewish perspective, there is within, again, the internal text of Jewish civilization, there's a view that Jews have things to learn from other civilizations. Right. So that's getting back to a cooperative approach. So it's an opportunity for Jews and also non-Jews to say, what solutions might Jewish civilization have to our current environmental crises, to our current problems with crime, to our problems with extremism, right? What might be the approach, right? So a solution-oriented approach.
I want to ask about that. Following up on that, does combating anti-Semitism require the anti-Semite to be a rational being. And isn't that a paradox? Because anti-Semitism by itself, by its nature, is irrational. And then can rationality remediate something grounded in irrationality?
Well, this is an excellent question, and it's one that the Frankfurt School dealt with. And I want to mention a shout out to a colleague called Lars Fischer, who's the one who sort of explained to me the Frankfurt School perspective. He's a scholar of anti-Semitism who follows the Frankfurt School perspective. And he says the Frankfurt School understood this issue. It's a paradox, right? Since the anti-Semite is so presumably some kind of prophylactic therapy would strengthen their rationality and their ego. But what do you do once anti-Semitism? So the Frankfurt School answers: you suppress it, you make it illegal, you make it taboo, right? You create laws, and in fact, the Frankfurt School argues that since most anti-Semites are authoritarian, paradoxically, they respond to making it illegal and making it taboo. So one of so that would be, so once you get into a situation like we have now, where you're kind of in an anti-Zionist wave, where people are, doing all kinds of totally, I mean, the level of irrationality you have to write a book about the Gaza war while barely mentioning Hamas is just astounding. I mean, it's truly astounding from people who most certainly would have an IQ of 130 or 40 or whatever if you did a test for them. So clearly, so that's that dimension, and that's the answer that the Frankfurt School, that what the answer from the Jewish civilizational texts is that you offer this. So the Jews repent, right? You are involved in military. So it's a military defeat. In fact, if you look at the two instances, at all of the instances, actually, of major encounters with anti-Semitic states within the Jewish tradition, what is the result? Some kind of defeat. Now, in the first instance with Egypt, the Egyptians get defeated by God, right? God brings his armies of plagues and the rest of it to get defeated by God operating through natural forces, right? And then subsequently, the Purim story is a story of military defeat. What does Esther get? She gets the ability. They don't rescind the decree. The Jews are allowed to arm themselves and then defeat the armies. What do you have in the story of Hanukkah? You have the defeat by the Maccabees of the army. So, and what do you have in the case of Nazi anti-Semitism? You have its defeat and then its suppression, right? So it's not, shall we put it, unsurprising that a significant portion of the traditionalist Jews, meaning Jews for whom Jewish civilization and its texts are important and valuable, view the defeat of the Iranian regime as the necessary means of moving forward against this anti-Semitism.
You also said something profound in your presentation here, that the anti-Semite always invokes a moral reasoning. And I wonder, is that why they get caught up in like blaming Israel for genocide, the most immoral of all immorality, and to kind of one up on the Jews and to feel morally superior for once?
Yeah. So again, the moral reasoning sort of relates to both the situation itself and like meaning the world that people live in, but also the values of the anti-Semite. And certainly if you think about anti-Semites as wanting to be superior than Jews, or getting some kind of comfort in being superior, then whatever they think is moral, so they will accuse the Jews of what they think is most immoral, and they will, accuse and they will sort of give themselves the perspective of what is most moral, right? And so that looks different. So one of the things that scholars of anti-Semitism have noticed, and one of the things today that's confusing, right? So you'll tell some person who's running around saying Israel's committing genocide and Israel's the most evil thing, so you're an anti-Semite. And I say, no, I've nothing. I don't mind. I know Jews who think that way, and I don't want to kill them. I don't want to put them in gas chambers, right? So a contemporary anti-Zionist, right, is not the same as a 1930s anti-Semite, because anti-Semitism it's not a fixed set of accusations. The accusations it's a fixed structure, right, of projecting onto the Jews what the people dislike, viewing themselves as superior to the Jews, and yet unconsciously being in some kind of competition with the Jews, or sometimes more openly, like when you look at the Nazi, or you look at the, within the Jewish sources, the Purim story in Haman. So that's why the content is different, right? What the Islamists are saying about the Jews is not entirely the same as what the far left is saying about Israel. There's some overlap, but that's so. This goes into what I think the Frankfurt School has done nicely, and I think and Sartre's, they wanted to move away from just a description of what anti-Semitism looks like over time and what anti-Semites do, which is important, right? Historians do that, but into a structure of why that might be the case, right? And so they develop that, and they use kind of psychological and sociological forms, and that's not so different from the Jewish civilizational perspective, which sort of talks about human moral choice, and then talks about the seeming characteristics of the anti-Semites, and what makes them choose the Jews as their antagonist.
Yeah, and also just another one, Leif, and you can take it. Just to follow up on that, it seems like if you point out something that you think is anti-Semitic, it's often the case that people find like they're taken aback by it, and they're kind of surprised by it, and it seems like they are themselves like surprised that they are doing something anti-Semitic. It's almost as if it's operating on a subconscious level, or more of a mechanism than a verb, that in the sense that they don't even know that they're acting out anti-Semitic tropes or mechanisms. What do you think about that? Is anti-Semitism more on the unconscious level than on the conscious level?
Yeah, well, so this would be, again, I'm referring to these other theoreticians of anti-Semitism, and I can also talk about my own lived experience, speaking to people who have anti-Semitic ideas. So certainly, one of the things that you can do, and I've had this experience a couple of times, is I've spoken to a person who's going on and on about how evil Netanyahu is, and then I'll simply say to them, I'll say, can you explain to me why Netanyahu is so much more evil than Khamenei in your eyes? Right? What are the characteristics that explain to me why you have spent so much time and so much energy and so much venom against Netanyahu? What are the objective characteristics that in your mind make him more evil than Khamenei? And when I say that, a lot of people, so the genuine anti-Semite, Sartre has a quote about this, and they will show their bad faith by just ending the conversation, or these are opportunities where there might be a moment between people. Look, since, as the Frankfurt School describes, or the Torah sources can talk about this, that their culture can become totally anti-Semitic, so that a person has to kind of work their way through rationality out of that, right? That because they've accepted certain things in the culture. So at this point, there's kind of ambient Jew hatred in Norwegian culture, right? And ambient things that are sort of accepted by that. And so people have to walk their way out of that rationally, right? And they and that requires, and some people are open to doing that, right? And some people are not. And so I think, in part of the work, when you expose anti-Semitism, I'm a big believer in exposing the irrationality, is that is to understand that exposing that irrationality, or simply doing journalism, right? Like actually doing true journalism or actually doing true history, may not work for a whole series of anti-Semites. So it's not a complete overlap with combating anti-Semitism. Combating anti-Semitism may require military defeat and making things illegal, right? That might be the only thing to stop irrational anti-Semites who kind of stir people up, right? anti-Semitic movements. And historically, that seems to be the case. The Nazis were not convinced out of their anti-Semitism. They were defeated militarily and subjected to re-education, and anti-Semitism was made illegal, right? Various forms of Holocaust and the rest of that. But in today, still, Jews who are doing good journalism, who are presenting, who are discussing, this is an important thing which may reach certain people, right? And that, so we don't, we don't have like a full, like we don't have like the magic pill, like, okay, if you use this educational formula, you can deprogram the anti-Semite. Right. And I'm sure you've had this experience in Norway. You've talked to a very reasonable, even probably likable and nice person who believes all kinds of nonsense. You give them a series of rational arguments why what they believe is nonsense. And they will 2 weeks later repeat the same nonsense.
Yeah. Life?
Yeah. Well, we're such a small minority in Norway, and there's Henrik and I are among them, and there are a few others, but there's only so many you can recruit from, around between 1,500 and 2,500 Norwegian Jews, right? And so I struggle all the time between two different impulses that I see among us. One is, and I think this is the case for the Jewish community worldwide, is one impulse is to pull back and into ourselves, right? To focus on sort of educating and reinforcing Jewish identity in whatever forms those come in, which I think relates to sort of your Torah perspective. And the other one is to take responsibility for the situation, which you also kind of alluded to, that we also need to sort of repent and do the stuff that we were promised we never had to do, but we still have to swallow that bitter pill and say, okay, we are going to have to take responsibility for combating these anti-Semitic and other tendencies by sort of explaining what Jewish civilization has to say about it, which I think which is less about being dogmatic and more about sort of articulating, confronting the contradictions and difficulties and ambiguity of the problems in our civilization writ large. Do you recognize that dilemma from your point of view?
Look, I think that it's multifaceted, meaning that so Sarah Judith Schneider's book discusses it, that if you have an enemy who wants to kill you, so you don't just pray for them to repent, right? According to this Hasidic master, you also take out your sword and you fight them, right? So the Jewish community, and in terms of the internal Jewish perspective, the number one priority is self-preservation of your life, right? There is a law in Judaism that you can violate almost any other Torah law in order to preserve your life. So that's number one. So I think that self-security and self-preservation is totally reasonable, and any effort to maintain that by Jews, whether in the diaspora or the state of Israel, is an important investment. The second element is that I do not think it is a waste of time for Jews to do truthful journalism, teaching of Jewish history, and truthful discussions of what Jewish civilization has to say about all manner of things, right? And I think that expressing that to the world is not a waste of time. It's not a waste of time also for the Jewish community itself, where young Jewish people, you see this particularly in the United States, are being persuaded by anti-Semitic Jew-hating versions of Judaism. Right? They learn about Jewish civilization through the anti-Semites, right? So Jewish culture, like any other culture, is invested in its own perpetuation on its own terms, and I think that that's reasonable. That's part of what makes human society vibrant and distinct. And I think so. Jewish community. So in the face of all kinds of lies about Jewish civilization, the Jewish community, for itself and for others, can teach things that are true to, and including debating with. It doesn't mean accepting everything in the tradition at face value. And also the Jewish tradition has many different interpretations of the text, even opposing ones. So, but being having a good faith relationship with that tradition, interpretation, etc., and internally and externally, right? And then I think that with the self-preservation model is I think there is an element which is being clear about the fact that when people are genocidal anti-Semites, they are not reasonable members of the body politic, right? Meaning that this is there is a difference between appreciating cultural difference and different opinions and accepting a group of people who lie about another group of people and on the basis of those lies want to kill them, right? Or want
Right.
to make them submit to. And that is a universal moral imperative, right? Whether it's for, and I think and it's a moral imperative in relation to Jews, but it's a moral imperative. And in fact, the today's anti-Zionists are trying to use that moral imperative with Palestinians, but they're doing it in a very, disingenuous and lying way. That's the whole basis of the genocide inversion, right? It's not Hamas that wanted to commit genocide. It's the Israelis that want to commit genocide, right? you know, uh, so, um, so I think so the Jewish community can do all those things, and in fact is required to do all those things, right? Just by self-preservation, right? Like it's not that on October 7th the Jews woke up and said, okay, now we have to take out our weapons, right? When the enemy comes to attack, and I mean that's just what you have to do, right? So there's an automatic response. But in terms of the Jewish, and I hope this will be for another talk, is that the Jewish texts have lots of very interesting things to say for our moment, our post-industrial society, for we have major challenges, AI, environment, labor.
Yes.
Lots of people are not living a fulfilled life. Huge swaths of the world are living in poverty, are living with disease, are not fulfilling their potential, not using their talents. And there are things within Jewish civilization, just like Western civilization has said, okay, let's have human rights, right? Or Christian civilization has says, let's use the example of Jesus and the apostles to behave better, and that will make a better world, right? Jewish civilization has some things to contribute to that broader discussion.
Yeah, I did some AI research while we've been speaking here. Turns out Jung never developed an archetype for the Jew, but of course there are many classical cultural images of the Jew, such as the wandering Jew. I don't know if you would call that an archetype or not, but however, how much is Israel, do you think, Olga, become a symbol for like the Jew, such as when people hate Israel, is that just a proxy for hating Jews?
Well, it may be for some people, but then it gets back to the question of why the Jews and why Israel. So there, I think we return to the answers that are given. So the Frankfurt School gives the answer of the historical connection to circulation because they're in this capitalist crisis mindset, right? And the and whereas the internal sort of the Jewish civilizational texts say whenever there's an antagonist who kind of has a beef with God, has a beef with a higher order, it deifies themselves, then they're going to run up with the Jews and Jewish
Hmm.
civilization, including at times where the Jews are not behaving according to their own texts. So
Right.
that's the paradox of of Mein Kampf, that Hitler uh, is his showing that he is that the Aryan is antithetical to Jewish morality, even though he's living in a time where there's a fair amount of Jewish assimilation to German culture, right? Even though it's not Jewish assimilation to Nazism, let's say. That's kind of that's the dynamic, and the ideologies that are very sort of hegemonic and are looking for kind of universal domination, tend to at some point run up against the Jews, right? And that's why Christianity and Islam have had this ambivalent relationship to the Jews and have had this replacement theology because they view themselves as kind of the hegemonic alternative, but that we've had in our lifetimes and even before in the 20th century some ways out of that, getting out of replacement theology to, again, this learning from each other, accepting common sources model.
We're coming towards the end of the episode here, so do you have any final question left before we round it off?
Well, I really hope we get an opportunity to have a talk about the subject that you raised, which is, what Jewish civilization can contribute to our contemporary grand challenges, because I think it's a lot. I guess my concluding thought, and I'd love to get your comment if there's any way to make it short enough within the allotted time frame, is that, I guess I feel that we that the importance of Jews shouldn't be, in my view, shouldn't be bashful about what we can contribute to the world, based on our civilization. It varies, of course, by individual. Maybe I can't contribute as much as I think I should, but this idea of setting aside the ego and having higher values, and even the sort of the secular approach is, I think we've been timid about it. We've been timid about our particularity in our effort to sort of comply with the universalist Enlightenment kind of values that now everybody, that seems to be ambient, but nobody really seems to understand. Am I making sense?
Yeah, no, so this is absolutely the story of Jewish modernity in the European period, which is that the European Enlightenment said, all religion, but especially Judaism, is, doesn't have much value. And in fact, it obscured. I have an essay in my book called Revising Secularism, which deals with this, which says actually there's lots of modern secular values that actually do have their basis in Jewish texts, etc. But so that you can, okay, go ahead and be Jewish, but do it on your own time, privately, and it's irrelevant. It's like doing yoga. It's a nice practice that makes you feel good and whatever. And I think the multicultural and anthropological turn in Western civilization and the humanities has shifted that a little bit, but not enough, right? Which is that today people say, no, unlike the old Enlightenment, no, Indian civilization has something to offer. Chinese civilization has something to offer. We can learn from indigenous communities. Doesn't mean we have to accept everything. It's not full relativism, but it's moved beyond the idea that Enlightenment European reason is the only way forward. So most Norwegians today, if you ask them, say, is there anything to learn from Chinese culture? They'll say, oh yeah, traditional Chinese philosophy. Do you think as a Norwegian anything could be learned from traditional fine? I think most Norwegians, they're automatic. They've been acculturated now to the post-anthropological approach. But I think that a lot of this could be stronger in the Jewish community. And that Jews can just say, look, we have an ancient civilization. We've got interesting texts. We've got the #1 global bestseller, and so let's we have something to add. You don't have to adopt it all, certainly, and but we don't need to be bashful about this. But you'll always encounter some anti-Semites who will come at you and say, oh, don't the Jews this and that and the rest of it. So but anyway, we'll leave that for another episode.
Yeah.
But that would be I think you're correct in your intuition about that.
Yeah, and people should really purchase your book as well, Olga, from anti-Zionism to a new Middle East.
Thank you. Yeah.
Where
Well,
can
I did
people
write
find
it to
that
be
on
bought.
Amazon? Huh? Come again?
I did write it so people would read it.
Yeah.
We'll promote it
Good job.
heavily. Yeah.
Yes.
It's on
definitely.
Amazon, and it has a Kindle version, and the paperback is only $10. So
Yes, I
there's
should
really
make
no
an audio
excuse.
version for
Yes.
I will hope to do that.
Definitely. Yeah, and we'd love to invite you several times also, Olga, for this. Is it's so interesting to talk to you, and we learn so much. So thank you so much for your time, Olga, and for your analysis and thoughts on this matter.
Thank you, and I want to thank all the teachers who taught me. And in a way, I'm just reporting, the thoughts and efforts of all these other scholars. So I want to thank them as well.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.